We're here with our third panel now, which is now how to move forward on some of the things that we talked about, right? Like changing laws and actually eliminating some of these barriers. And moderating this panel, who we met earlier, is Aramis Ayala. We have Phil Agnew from Florida, from South Florida here. He's a community organizer, founder of the Dream Defenders and Smoke City Studios. We have Alex Vitale, who's a professor at Brooklyn College, who focuses specifically on policing. We have George Ascon, who you guys actually heard about earlier, who's the DA in San Francisco and who received some of the best praise I think we got from Christy Lopez, who was a progressive prosecutor before that existed. And Sean Shaw, also from Florida, a former state representative in the 61st district and was the Democratic Party's first black nominee for Attorney General in the state. So with that.
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
My garbage out here.
No problem. So as the last panel, I think it's important to have a group of people who have been on the front line and understand the issues. So we're talking about where do we go from here. I'm sure everyone was sitting here thinking about, well, we're talking about the problems, what do we do next? And that's what we want to talk about here. And I want to talk a little bit about framing the issue, because I said earlier that's how we determine the end of it. And a lot of times you get a very strong polarization between the community and then police officers because they feel attacked, and sometimes rightly so. I think it's important to understand whatever we do for a living, like I'm an attorney, I'm a prosecutor, I'm a public official, you're an organizer, you're a prosecutor, you've been in the legislature, and it's really difficult to take criticism from someone who has never sat in your seat. If you talk to some of the players, people criticize them and they've never been on a field. So I think we have to be very mindful that we communicate the message that we are not criticizing them, we are trying to find answers for dead bodies, and we're trying to find answers for mistreatment of the community because it is a problem. So moving right on into it, I want to ask a question and just open it up for the panel. We've talked about a lot about the problems, not a novel idea. The question is this fixable? Is this something that we can fix? And let's take it to you first, Sean.
Thanks, Aramis. And I'm always honored to be on a panel with Aramis, who's just a superstar here in Florida. It is fixable if we want to fix it, right? And I think everybody in this room wants to fix it, but unfortunately, there's a huge segment of this population who this entire discussion is lost on. No matter how many names get on that list of people who've had fatal encounters with police, it won't trigger anything for them. And I was telling someone backstage, politically, a lot of people are, why don't legislatures do something about this? Why aren't we changing laws? And I want you to think about the response to Kaepernick taking a knee. And think about this country's response to that, how polarizing it was, how the conversation was immediately shifted to patriotism, away from the actual reason why Kaepernick was taking a knee. And there's your answer as to why politically nothing's being done. Because this is an issue that we're not there yet politically, and we've got to push elected officials, no matter how progressive the prosecutors are. They're still limited in what they can do because the law is what the law is. If you want to change the law, it is legislatures, it is Congress, and they've got to make changes, and they aren't there yet. In Florida, both parties talk about how criminal justice reform is a big deal. Nothing is being done on criminal justice reform that's meaningful in Florida. And I hate to bust your bubble, but it's just not happening, no matter how many fancy speeches we give behind podiums, because the political pressure isn't being brought to bear enough to make people do it. That's what we have to do, in my opinion. This has to be pressure brought to bear on those that are running for legislature, state senate, state representative, Congress, so that we make some meaningful legal reforms at that level.
George, do you think this is something that is fixable? Is the problem fixable?
Well, it is fixable, but let me first of all say a couple of things. The police accountability and criminal justice reform are all connected. You cannot have one without the other. So let's, I hear sometimes people trying to disconnect, talk about police accountability as somehow this is an island. But the reality is you can't really reach accountability unless you're looking holistically at criminal justice reform, number one. Number two, I think we kid ourselves when we talk about the system being broken, and frankly, I have sometimes caught myself saying that. The system is not broken. The system is doing what it's designed to do. Yeah. So we have to be honest about it and say, the system is working exactly the way it was designed to do. I heard one of the previous panels talk about the origins of policing in the South and the North as being basically out there, trying to go after runaway slaves. This is a continuation of the system, and then, brown people came in the picture, and you sort of kind of evolve into that. I'm all for diversity, and I respect the comments that the gentleman was making in the audience earlier, but I tell you, I've been to police departments that were minority majority, and we still have the same problems. And I have tried, I've looked at, officer-involved shootings involving African-American officers and African-American individuals in our community that are awful. And so the race really didn't make any difference, And by the way, the police union, rally around that office just as they would, around anybody else. I heard Aramis talk about, blue, and there is no diversity on blue, and I agree with her. So I think that we have to begin coming from a place first to say, look, the system is not really broken. The system is doing what it's designed to do. Now, do we have the courage and do we have the ability to move forward and to start developing a new system? And to your question, Aramis, I think we do. And I think that we're seeing an evolution of that. We're a long way from that. But, we have to reduce mass incarceration. We have to reduce the opportunities for police to be in contact over policing communities of color. When you start going through that path, then you're going to start reducing a lot of the contacts that probably don't need to happen, because it should not be a police officer that responds to the call in the first place. It should be maybe a mental health professional or a social worker or somebody else other than somebody with a gun. So I just want to put that out there.
No, that's all good information, because we talk about the accountability, we talk about, all the partnerships. Like you said, it's not just one individual person that's part of it. Alex, when you think about us being able to fix this problem, what are some of the things that are necessary, if it's even something that can be remedied?
Well, I want to agree with a lot of what George said, and not just the legacy around slave catching, but you mentioned Latinos, would think about the legacy of the Texas Rangers, which were the first Western police force whose job was to basically facilitate the extermination of the indigenous population, to drive out the Mexican and Spanish landowners, to make way for white settlement. This is the legacy of policing, and in the North also the management of working populations, the suppression of their workers' movements. And so there's a huge disconnect in the discourse around police reform, which is we have this deep analysis of the fundamentally problematic nature of policing, which today is about managing mass homelessness, mass untreated mental illness, mass involvement in black markets, et cetera. But then we say the solution is community policing or a training program, like implicit bias training. Yeah, there's a problem of racism in policing, but it's not unconscious and unintentional individual discretionary decision making. First of all, we got a lot of explicit racism in policing, and we heard the statements read earlier from one of the local union officials, and we saw the officers fired in Detroit a couple weeks ago for the explicit racist statements they were making. And this is not going to be fixed by trying to somehow appeal to some stereotypes that they might unconsciously be carrying. But the problem for me is even deeper than that. It's the mission of policing reproduces racial inequality. When we tell the police to wage a war on crime, a war on drugs, a war on gangs, a war on immigrants, a war on terror, they cannot be friendly, they cannot be unbiased, and they cannot be a source of justice in the community. And even we have this idea, well, if we could just create some kind of community policing mechanism to get the police to know the community better, that maybe this is part of the solution. And I just don't think it is. In part because community policing rests on the premise of bring us your problems and we'll work together to figure out solutions. But what tools do the police have to solve our community problems? Do they have drug treatment on demand? Do they have affordable housing? Do they have access to high quality mental health services? No. They have guns and handcuffs and ticket books and are driving the mass criminalization of the most vulnerable populations in our society.
You know, Alex, that's a really good point when you're talking about community, and it helps me make the link into Philip, because you know, a lot of us had never heard about a community organizer until President Obama explained that this is, you know, where he came from. And that link from the street up to the White House is what allowed a lot of the conversations to begin. So when you hear Alex talk about, you know, law enforcement not being properly equipped to do any community policing, tell us how that impacts those of people who are on the front line.
Oh, well, good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'm in the unfortunate position of being the last speaker out of 3 panels, so I'm going to be rehashing a good amount of what's been said. But if I can add just a little bit of another piece to the history of policing, even if it's just a review for folks. They started in the South as slave catchers, returning slaves or enslaved Africans to slave masters. They started in the West as a means of implementing Western expansion for business interests, and in the North were municipalized by Boston, New York, et cetera, to protect the interests of protect mercantile interests. And so the history of policing is inherently about protecting not only the racial stratus of our country, but also protecting the economic, protecting property, protecting the elites. It never was in the interest of serving and protecting poor peoples. And so if you look at it from that lens as a community organizer, it is hard to answer the question of whether policing can be fixed, because we believe that policing inherently is an instrument of the state. And it has been mentioned earlier, a paramilitary institution now in many of our communities. So to answer your initial question, I do not believe that policing in its current form can ever be fixed or remedied. There can be cosmetic changes that are made to the contours and the application of what they do, but inherently their job is to enforce and give enforcement to poor people, black people, Latino people, immigrants, women, and give protection to elites and to the wealthy. They get policing, they get safety, we get policing. And so the conversation is about what does it take for a community to be considered safe, and what is safety, and what we need is a radical reconception of what is safety in our communities. And Alex has alluded to it. Police officers absolutely have been on their lap has been thrown all of the social ills that a capitalist system generates. It creates mass underemployment, miseducation, undereducation. You pile people up in ghettos and projects, et cetera, and tell them they have no prospect for ever advancing, no opportunity to educate themselves, no opportunity to advance beyond some sort of generational curse that's been placed on them for no other reason but being black. And then you say, here, police, this is what you have to do to handle it. And so for us, our solution is an abolitionist framework. We say we've got to find ways to build safety and make our communities feel safe beyond police, period. And so restorative justice is a practice that a number of the organizations that are around Miami, around the country, around the state have begun to practice, because we say the goal of justice is to make to right the wrong and to make one feel whole after a wrong has been committed. And our current justice system is not built for that. And so that's a practice that we're involved with. For those that don't know about restorative justice, my abridged kind of definition of it for you, it is a practice that centers the person who has been harmed and puts that person as the center of a process that is community-led to figure out how to right that wrong. And so no matter, when a police officer even gets arrested, there's no amount of training that the state has. There's no infrastructure that the state has to make what has been done right, or at least attempt to make what has been done right with the person who has been harmed or the family that has lost someone. Even the financial recourse that some families have, that doesn't come from the police department. That is the state or the taxpayers who pay for the police department, then paying for the use of force or the murder that has been perpetrated by the police department. And so for us, as a community organizer, we are looking at ways outside of reform of the police system, because we believe in it is inherently unjust. And so we're looking at restorative justice practices as a means for finding safety and justice.
I want to stay right there for a second. Plus, I want you to be able to be first this time, right? So when you're talking about the community fixing, you're talking about restorative justice measures, explain to me how what the police are continuing to do, how that can hurt or harm, because everything that we do is moving in one direction. It's either continuing to perpetuate ills or we're fixing it. Nothing in life is neutral. Nothing stands still. So if you're doing this, are you working against something like going up a down elevator? How is that impacting what you're doing?
Well, in the current context, we've got to work with, I'm presenting a more, what is seen by some as a more radical point of view. That is our North Star. How do we build communities that are safe, have adequate education, housing, healthcare, jobs, et cetera? That's a safety mechanism. That's our North Star. In the interim, I think we've got to work with police departments to demilitarize. They should not have the weapons and the equipment that they have. The current way that Miami police operate, countywide, citywide, I've never in my life had an interaction with a police officer that I would deem as pleasant, right? I've had people say I'd rather lose we never called the police. And so for me, the police are a non-factor when I'm thinking about, how to improve the conditions, because the police I've never been able to frame the police as an accomplice in safety or in building some sort of solution to what we see. And so that is a harder question for me to ask. I think absolutely police have worked against what we've tried to do, because at the basis of what we're trying to do is take power away from that institution. And so no one is willing to give up that amount of power. We want budgetary oversight. We want hiring oversight. We have a community oversight board that hasn't had subpoena power, right? That has been rendered mute, really. And so I don't see ways that they can take part in it.
Understanding. So I see a lot of head nodding, and it sounds like you're saying we just have to do this on our own. And when I'm looking at Sean, George, and Alex, a lot of the conversation uses words like education, partnerships, accountability, and those are the buzzwords that make us feel good about the conversation. I want to dive in a little bit. What does that really look like, and is it possible? Alex?
So I've been studying policing for over 20 years, and I'm very pessimistic about that. I think, along with Phil, I think that we have to go over their heads. That this is a problem of political accountability, not police accountability. A totally lawful, proper, unbiased, legal, low-level drug arrest is still going to ruin some young person's life for no damn good reason. It is substantively unjust, and narcotics units do not need anti-bias training. We need to get rid of the war on drugs. And this is the strategy, I think, that communities have to undertake as a conscious political strategy to build community power to take these missions away from police. We have more NYPD personnel in New York City schools than counselors of all varieties combined. And that is substantially unjust. And those school safety officers do not need better training. They do not need to be friendlier. They need to find a different job in a community center, as mental health counselors, etc.
Yeah, I agree, and I want to also add another component to this, and this is the prosecution component, because we often forget that, well, certainly police does a lot of the problematic work at the field level. The reality is that the prosecutors come in and they put the nail in the coffin, and they have in this country for many, many years. Over-incarceration in this country really is not driven by police. It's driven by prosecutors that are elected officials that have been elected, quite frankly, on the tough on crime, platform, and they continue to be. And again, we're talking about taking the system and turning it upside down. I totally agree with the comments about restorative justice, and this is going to, drive even some of our defense partners here upside down. But I have to tell you that I have come to the conclusion after having been in the business for over 30 years and now 9 years as an elected prosecutor, and allegedly one of the most progressive counties, and yet one that, I tell you, when you look behind the curtain, there's nothing progressive about what we do. And I would tell you that even the system, the adversarial system that we have is so broken that it's unfixable unless we're willing to start taking off-ramps. And what we have been doing in our office, we're taking entire off-ramps where we put young kids into a truly restorative justice model. We look at the New Zealand model of community conferencing. We take lawyers out of the room. We put these kids through, and every one of those kids has a much better chance of not coming back than every one of the kids that we put through the regular system. We're now punching it up to our age of 18 to 25. And my goal eventually would be to make that our mainstream of looking at everything that we do. We have a county now that when I came in, we were always max capacity in our jail system, and we were sending a lot of people to prison. We have consistently run about 50% capacity. That means that there are less people in the jail every day. That means that we're not contaminating those people with other people that are already having all kinds of problems, whether it's mental health driven or otherwise. We have, I came to a county that we prosecuted 60% of our workload was drugs. We're now in the 20 percentile. So the work really has to be redefined, and prosecutors play a major role, because the prosecutors not only coalesce and frankly, sometimes almost are in cahoots with the police, but they're the ones that really drive this bus at the end of the day. So it's a more complicated thing, and just simply saying police, yes, we have to alter the mission of policing, I agree, but it has to go through the entire system.
Sean, you've done a lot of, obviously you've spent much of your career making the law, as being part of the legislature in Florida. I talked about the buzzwords, education, changes of law, accountability. Tell me, is that part of the fix? And if it is or isn't, tell me how the conversations in Congress will they ever reach that level of change?
I don't think those are part of the fix. That's not a fix. That just makes us feel better, as someone said. Look, I think this is accurate. We've heard a lot of panelists talk about how bad it is in Miami, about how the Miami Police Union head has made some problematic statements. I believe it's accurate that there's never been a prosecution of a police officer under the current state attorney here in Miami. You can't tell me those things aren't linked.
Yep.
And that's a political solution. Do you elect more people like Aramis, or do you have what you have here in Miami-Dade with someone who has never found a police officer that's ever committed misconduct? I mean, these are issues, that's the real change that you have to make. All this, there's a lot of study about the policies and things we could do, and none of that stuff gets done. None of these independent review boards, politicians have to implement that. How strong is the language about the subpoena power they may or may not have? Yeah. Politicians have to implement that. And people that you elect. And so do you know who your politicians are, how they feel about these issues, how they may have voted on the independent review bill that came? Like, all these things are important. We've got to push people in power to make these changes. And I know I'm speaking from the political lens and all these things because it's my background, but that's how the change is going to happen. And until those people in power are required to have these conversations, Aramis, in conference rooms and in committees, then what you're going to continue to get is what we have now. People that get behind podiums and say, I'm for this, and then when they walk away from that podium, they're never going to do anything that actually requires real change, because a vast majority of this country, or the electorate at least, really are very, not prone to do anything that even would approach holding police accountable.
So I want to go into another area. When we have this conversation, most people, at least who are even interested in the conversation, have similar viewpoints, that it's a deeper issue. We're looking at the history of the country. It requires a major overhaul. If outsiders are the only one having the conversation about inside change, does that create another obstacle?
Yes. But again, we have the power to change who's on the inside and who's on the outside. And that's what we have to do. We have to, you're a great example. Aramis is a great example of elections have consequences. And you elect more state attorneys like State Attorney Ayala and like this gentleman right next to me. That's how you start getting change. And elections matter. This has a huge political component to it, a huge one. And we cannot just, be in the kind of academia of what policy works and what doesn't. This is a political question largely. And politics is a reflection of us. And so we need to make sure those people that are on the outside right now are then on the inside this next election cycle, and then we have people that maybe can do this.
So, I agree, I see your point, but can we ever really minimize the value of education? Because part of politics is educating the people. Is there that deeper-rooted education that we talked about on the first panel? Can that influence the politics of it? Go ahead, Phil.
Well, just to be really brief, I agree that it's a holistic approach. I think what we're seeing here, or what we've seen in Ferguson, what we're seeing in Jackson, Mississippi, is the result of people on the ground advancing a politic, practicing how to govern, and then ascending into elected office and being able to move forth a policy or a program that they had actually worked on before elected office. So I think it is both. I think it's community organizations. I'm a huge believer that community organizations are the vehicle for transformational change, and then they must be.
They push.
They
push.
They have to. So to answer your question directly, I think it is a social. We learn about punishment, crime and punishment, not just in school. We learn about, just to broaden our scope of it, we also learn about it in church. We learn that if you do wrong, that there will be hellfire and brimstone placed upon you. Children learn about punishment, what happens when something goes wrong in your home. And so what I'm presenting is that what we're talking about is we've got to step back as a society and look and say, what is justice to us as a society? Because I do think inherently people do, one of the issues that we come up against in doing restorative justice is that inherently we're all taught, whether it's in school, whether it's in church, whether it's on films, that if you do something wrong, you must be punished, period. And so it's still hard for people who say, I don't want to use this current legal system or this current justice system. I don't want to send someone away to prison. It's still hard for people to reconcile that something that doesn't seem painful is not going to happen. You know what? You understand? And so what I'm saying is that we've got to envision through our religious practices, through our parental practices, how it is that we raise up a generation of people that have a new conception of what happens when you make a mistake, or whether when you have run afoul of the social norms or the customs of your society. Are you banished from that society? Is a painful rendering of punishment supposed to happen? And that's the kind of thing that we've got to look at. And I think community-based organizations are the perfect vehicle to begin to build alternatives, not just to policing, but to politics, that show a new value system of what happens when a wrong has been done to the person who has done the wrong, and maybe especially for the person who has been wronged.
Can I just add to that? There's a question about what do we mean by knowledge here? So there's been a real tendency by funders, by academics, to think of knowledge in these technocratic terms. What's the procedural fix? What's the training program? What's the little tick in the contract with the police that's going to fix all this? Then there's the knowledge that's happening on the ground, the kind of work that Phil is doing, and people like Phil all across the country who are starving for resources, who are trying to change the conversation on the ground. And I think we got to quit putting money into projects that imagine that we're going to fix the police with some little procedural tweak, and instead invest in building community power to demand the kinds of resources and community-led solutions that are going to produce real justice in these communities.
I just want to say also that I think we make a mistake when we believe that training is going to shift organizational culture, especially when it comes to law enforcement. That's not going to happen, and we've tried that for the last 30 years. By the way, I'm sorry that I may offend some people here, but I even laugh when I hear community policing and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. That really is a joke. Okay, yep. And take it from me. I've been in the business for long enough to know what I'm talking about. I think you have to create. First of all, and I don't care whether it's policing or almost any industry, revolutions come from the outside. Mm-hmm. And there are certain parts of our system that require a revolutionary way of looking. You need disruption, right? The taxi industry would never have created Uber. And I'm not necessarily saying Uber is a good solution, but it would never have come from the taxi industry, right? It was somebody else that came up with the idea, hey, let's everybody share your car, you come and go as you want, and we'll put it on the app and you move on, and it completely revolutionized the way that we look at this type of transportation today. Fixing policing and fixing the criminal justice system is not going to come from within alone. There has to be a tremendous amount of pressure from the outside, and I agree that a lot of those foundations have put so much money into tinkering around procedural things internally are not, the money is being misapplied. It's not going to get us the answer. But I do believe that our political, our political elected officials play a role in, frankly, and I know that I often offend people, but there's a tremendous lack of courage when it comes to elected officials. Look, I have been involved in 2 statewide initiatives in California. One that I was invited to, which was the reform of the 3 strikes in California, which was probably the most punitive 3 strikes in the country. We had people literally doing 25 years to life for stealing a loaf of bread out of a supermarket. And then it was Prop 47, which was designed in my office, was really revolutionizing the way that we looked at drug possessions and saying, if you're using drugs for personal use, it's going to be a misdemeanor. I don't care what kind of drugs it is. And if the prosecution and the police wants to say that it wasn't personal use, then the burden is on them to show that it was sales, and we automatically cut prosecutions of drug possession by a huge number. But those things came after we went to the legislators, they refused to do it, and we went out publicly. Now California has the way to have a initiative system, so we can go to a referendum to the voters, and this is where it shows that the voters are actually. There's a huge disconnection between the voters, even those in the more conservative community, and often on what our elected officials are doing. So we have to start looking at how do you disrupt the system, and it has to be a combination, but the force has to come from the outside.
So one of the questions that when we talk about the community doing it, people like Philip, people on the outside bringing this change, one of the most interesting aspects of this is the credibility of the people who want to make that change. A lot of times it's people who have had experience with the system, meaning that they have their own criminal background. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about how that can be an impediment to the movement, whether or not they have the ability, because in some places, Florida just beginning to change it, they couldn't vote. So if we're saying that voting has an impact, and that's one of the largest aspects of it, the people who know the changes that need to happen don't even have the ability to vote for the people to make it happen. Then you also have them standing, they may not have the education to sound as articulate as someone else, or they may have a criminal background that is strong as they seem, as right as they are, as connected as they are, they do not have the credibility. So I want to talk if that's too big of an obstacle, or if that is an obstacle that can be overcome.
Well, I tell you, and here's where sometimes you have to know your audience and how you present your idea. But when I talk about criminal justice reform, I try to convey the ultimate message, but I try to take the approach that I think is going to be most successful with my audience. If I'm talking to an audience that is politically conservative, I may be talking about the economic impact of over-incarceration. If I'm talking to a community that sees more the way that I do, I may be talking about social justice. Sometimes I'm going to mix the two. I think when we're talking about individuals that perhaps have a prior criminal record, the way that I come at them, and it doesn't really matter which way, is if you want people to be reintegrated into a community, if you want to provide for greater public safety opportunities, you have to be willing to allow people room for redemption. You have to give them a space, and part of the space is being able to be part of the political process, regardless of whether they have been arrested or prosecuted or convicted before, number one. Number two, it's sometimes good to talk about the disproportionality of the criminal justice system. You may be talking to someone that has a prior conviction for drugs, but I tell you what, you can talk to any white American community and you tell them, tell me in this room, how many people have never used an illegal drug? Raise your hand. And if they're honest, there's very few people that are going to raise their hand. And believe me, I've tried this, so I can tell you that it works. And then the next question is, how many of you have been arrested for that drug, possession and use? And again, very unlikely that there's going to be any hands coming up unless you have a poor white person coming from a poor community, or they had a black friend or a brown friend, and they got arrested with them. And then you say, you know what, if we had a room full of brown and black people here, and I ask the same questions, there will be a lot of hands going up for the same behavior that you committed and you had no criminal consequences, but they did. Now, is that fair? And when you start coming and putting it into those terms, you start then winning some hearts and minds to then be willing to listen to that person that, guess what? Yeah, they were convicted. Yeah, they did a little hard time somewhere, but now we want to bring him back, and we got to give him an opportunity to be part of the system and part of the solution, and not somebody that is going to be continuously marginalized because they're going to continue to hurt themselves and hurt others.
And we're going to go to questions in just a little bit, but I want to talk about how the conversation, and I want to go to you, Alex. A lot of times we're talking about justice and we're talking about communities, and the one thing that nips that conversation in the bud is when law enforcement says, but safety. So let's talk about how the safety begins to change the conversation and impacts negatively the progress that this conversation has.
Yeah, and Phil and I were talking about that earlier today, and it's something that consumes both of our attentions continuously as we go around trying to talk about this work. Our communities have problems. My students face tremendous problems at Brooklyn College. There are problems of violence and drug overdoses and untreated mental health problems, and these produce additional problems for communities. And we have to put that front and center in the work we do. The problem is that criminal justice-led solutions often do not work in solving those problems. They manage those problems. They do not solve them. And even when they can point to a study here or there that shows some incremental improvement because of what they did, it comes with tremendous collateral consequences. It's about Xing out 20% of the community to save 80% of the community, and that's not justice. Justice is, how do we build up communities? How do we build up individuals so that we don't have these problems? And that means investing in things like drug treatment on demand and summer youth jobs and quality community-based mental health services and community-based anti-violence initiatives. That's how we produce safety. And we've got an ocean of research about programs like restorative justice in the school, when properly implemented, well-funded, done from top to bottom, it is better.
Alex, I want you to go a little bit deeper in that, because all of us who have worked in here, the change has come on the heels of research and numbers and data to justify what it is that we're doing. And, you know, working in a college setting, is research and data part of this conversation of what is next and how, what type of research?
Well, that's part of what you were alluding in the question to George, and this is something I struggle with because I have both a background as an organizer and a background as a researcher. And the reality is there's a huge gulf between these two things, unfortunately, right? That there's, and both sides bear some responsibility for this, for sure. In the sense that too often the organizers are caught up in the day-to-day struggle to keep their movements alive, to find funding, to build power. And they know sometimes there's research out there, but they cannot always figure out how to negotiate it, in part because the researchers are not helping them. Because the researchers are focused on their everyday imperatives of publish or perish, get the right piece in the right peer-reviewed journal, and the language that's necessary for that kind of academic success is alienating to the people who are actually doing the work on the ground. So I spend a lot of my time trying to pull these camps together, because we got to center the leadership in the communities. We got to build that community power. But just because someone has been beaten over the head by a police officer doesn't necessarily mean that they have the wisdom and experience and the knowledge about what alternative visions might look like. We got to figure out how to work together on this.
Yeah, please. Really quickly, agree fully, our communities do have problems, but the overall problem is our country chose an economic system that by nature produces inequality, that produces alienation, that produces all manner of destructive tendencies in people because of the economic system of capitalism. And that trash that this economic system produces is then dumped into communities. And poor people, black people, Latino people, immigrant people are faced with the weight of that every single day. And so we can't divorce a conversation on safety and policing away from an economic system that we are all living under, that will continuously over and over and over produce the type of things that we see. And whether the center of that pain is in black communities or in Latino communities, it will always reproduce. There will always be a need for police. There will always be a need for prison. When there are no jobs, when there's nothing for people to do, you've got to hide those people away. You can't have those people roaming around. And so I think we've got to have a holistic conversation for all like-minded people who want to see a change and want to see communities safe. We cannot divorce that from the fact that we are all under an economic system that by nature will produce what we're seeing.
Philip, I think that's, I think that's a great place to stay just for a second and open it up for conversation with the rest of the panelists, because we are currently under a president who says, let's make America great again. And we don't understand the damage of what that means when we're saying, what is again? Like, when was it great for people who were in this room? And it means a return to the pain that we're trying to get out of. It means a return from the advancement and progress that the civil rights movement has enacted. So when we're having this conversation now, I want to talk a little bit about how, when people make comments, oh, well, you're complaining about this country, go back to yours, or, you know, like, you don't belong here. What can we do? Because this is way bigger than just crime. I think we have to understand the answer really is just the human being who lives in this country. So how do we begin to change that conversation from just the limited focus of crime and safety and justice to the larger element, which is the humanity or the dehumanization of other Americans?
That's tough. That's considering who the president is. I just want to say, I want to remind people, when Colin Kaepernick started taking the knee, President Trump's response to it, and his continued nipping at it anytime that he wants to evoke a reaction from his folks. And it's not by accident. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that he can change the conversation from what we're talking about to some political conversation about whether you're a patriot or whether you ought to stand for the flag, when these two things are totally disconnected. He's playing in the worst, and I don't want to turn it to a Trump panel because my heart can't take it today, but he knows exactly what he's doing. That's why I answered the question. It is tough because, you know, when I was running for AG, we had the issue that's still going on with these detention centers, potentially here in Miami. And children of immigrants were literally being locked up in cages. And it was awful then, it's awful now, and we made a big deal about it. And I just thought, and I'm a little naive, I just thought inherently people can't agree with that. Like, you know, their children are children. That's just, yeah, I'll do a press conference and this isn't a big deal. It turned out to be a huge political deal because there were a lot of people who believed if you come here illegally, so what? You're subject to anything, including having your children locked up. And that's just, it's not something I saw coming, and it's not something that I'm familiar with, but it is there, and it's a huge segment of this population that we've just got to continue to push and argue about the humanity of some of the things we're doing. And the, like George said, the economic argument when you're speaking to one group, or the humanity argument when you're speaking to another group, it depends on who you're speaking to, but, you know, Amendment 4 in this state, I think, is a great blueprint of how we could do some of this stuff.
And for those who are maybe unfamiliar,
Amendment 4 was the amendment, the constitutional amendment led by the people to get it on the ballot that allowed returning citizens to vote. This is the restoration of the right to vote. It's taken from you in Florida. Here, the amendment would give it back, and it wasn't really political. 60% of the people have to pass these amendments. It passed by, I think, 64, 65%, which means a lot of Republicans voted for that. And I think it's a good blueprint for if we want to do some of these reforms and you want to go around the legislature and around some other people, we can do a citizens-led initiative to do some of these things. I think it's a great blueprint, at least in this state, as to how some of these things can be done in a non-overtly kind of partisan way.
Thanks, Sean. I think we're going to start opening it up for some questions. But before we do, one of the primary goals of this particular panel is to stay focused on where do we go from here. And we've talked about we talked about the very deep-rooted education to understand what we're working with in the history. You know, we've talked a little bit about partnerships. It is not just prosecutors. It's not just police. It's not just the community, but it's the partnership of all of them. I think Alex made it one of the most powerful parts of the solution is that making certain whatever solution we're talking about, it aligns with the problem that has been identified. And I think that's an area we don't talk about. And then also bridging some of the gaps between the community and research, and that can be very powerful. So while I want everyone to have an opportunity to ask whatever questions, because there's it's a small window, I want to make certain that we really, really do stay focused so that we all leave here empowered with a common message and a strong, powerful unity of how we move forward.
Okay, thank you. First question.
Thank you. One of the commonalities of the discussions of the panel has been that diversity is one component. Now, I'm not saying it's the final answer, you understand, but it is one component of solving the killings of blacks dying at 2.5% the rate of whites. Now, we have to do what the Players Coalition is capable of doing. I mean, some of the suggestions regarding legislation may be out of their wheelhouse, but creating a program that will attract blacks to law enforcement, being that the commonality is diversity, is one component. I want to know why the Players Coalition is not pursuing that component that is a commonality.
Oh, yeah, take that.
You keep asking questions about what Player Coalition isn't doing, and it's frustrating. I'm gonna be honest with you. You have someone that's here that's trying to help you do something, and you keep questioning what we're doing. First of all, we talk about, as a kid, when you see a cop come in and kill your brother, you see the cops come in and antagonize your family, and that's all you see as a kid. Now, when do you know a kid want to grow up and be like that person? Have you ever thought about that? See, the thing is, you can either be a complainer or a contributor. You can't be both, and you can't do it when it's convenient for you. So when you have someone that's here that has presented a platform, and when you talk about legislators being over our head, apparently you haven't read up on your facts, because they have had legislators to pass. So when you have a question about what's up there, changing laws and eliminating barriers. And that's what we're talking about. Not to come here and ask what Player Coalition has done, because we presented a platform for you to come on a Saturday morning when we could have been somewhere else. I was in Dominican Republic yesterday, on the beach. I flew back to have a conversation in your community. So for you attacking us, that's really not the stand or the platform for it to happen.
Can I add something to that, and then maybe we come back? But you asked a question.
Okay.
You asked a question of us. Maybe.
Okay, time out. What we're gonna do, sir, I'm gonna give you a chance to answer. There's been a response, and I think that it is appropriate to allow you to ask a question as a follow-up, and then if our panelists want to address. Sir.
Yes.
Okay, responding to what you're saying here, the Player Coalition has been given $89 million to spend on.
That's not true. That's not true.
What is true?
No, that's what you're saying again.
That's what is in the paper. I'm not. This is not.
So now we again, there's opinions and there's facts, and facts always trump emotions.
Okay, you were not given any money.
Yeah, that's not what you said, but that's not what the panel is about.
Okay, the
Correct.
Now, the commonality here among all these panelists, once again, is diversity. And I ask
No,
you-
it's not.
No.
That's not. That's
Just
not.
really
not
quick.
true.
All right,
Just
time out, time out.
I'm
All right.
not one of those.
This is my panel, all right? What, at this point, the goal of this conversation at this point is the solutions. And I can assure you that I don't have any personal relationship with either one of these panelists, but for me having had to stand up and speak out about injustices in this state of Florida, they have both personally offered me their support and resources and whatever it means. Our ability to stand here and come together in this conversation is one of the most powerful things that they can do. And I think that it's sort of like the conversation that President Obama is often quoted by saying, be the change you want to see. They have done it, and I encourage you to do the same thing. I don't mean it in a pejorative way, but I think that we have to be very mindful that we're here for a productive conversation, and we're not going to get anywhere when we're criticizing people who have given their resources, given their money, especially when we're perpetuating the criticism that are based upon information that is not factual. So I think the better thing is I want to give them one more opportunity to explain what it is that their goals are and what it is that they're doing. And I encourage you that if you think that diversity is something important, and if you have the resources to be that, it's a good thing to do, to be a part of it and be a part of the work and not just the conversation. So I'm going to turn it back over to you. And Anquan, if you want to come up, I know it's touchy. I know it's not exactly where we want to be, but I think one of the best things that we can do is work together so that we're working on truth. We have been divided as a country because we constantly have okayed and justified things that are not true. And when we stand together, it must be on foundations of truth. Otherwise, we are being blind as we're walking. So,
We're not for what? Sir.
I think the proper thing at this point is that is not an area for discussion right now. If you have questions, I'm sure they have management, they have places that you can answer, but the reality is they have invested their time and their resources, and there ain't nobody in this room who want to be questioned about what they do with their money when they're actually producing things like this. So we're going to go on to the next question.
Here, next question.
Well, could I just say something about the substance of that question, though, which is I do not think that's what this panel has been saying. I do not believe that hiring more black police officers is in any way the solution to this problem. It needs to be a question of racial justice, which in my mind does not mean hiring more black police officers. It means empowering communities of color to get the resources they need to produce safety.
If I could say, if it's a black police officer pulling me over, I know I'm getting a ticket. I know I'm getting a ticket. I'm sorry. I just have to. I've been trying to be professional, but I know the black police officer, especially if he's with a Cuban police officer or a white police officer, he's going double hard. He's going absolutely.
And that's what all the research shows.
That is not going to help at all. I've never seen. I whisper to me, "Hey son, I got you. Don't worry, bro." None of that is happening. I don't care if it's a black officer. If it is, I look at Aja and I'm like, it's definitely gonna go bad.
But I also think that it's important too what you said you need to say louder, because you mentioned what you believe would happen. There is constant research that indicates and supports that it is not the color of skin of the police officer, but the position of police officer that matters what happens.
Although as Christy mentioned, gender does matter. There is good research that shows that female police do not have as many complaints, do not use as much force, but on racial diversity, no positive effect whatsoever.
Now, in support of what you're saying, I think that we all agree with what was your premise, is that diversity is something that matters, but we have to stay focused on the fact that it's the diversity that is brought to the table and that is allowed to freely flow within that. That diversity is important. Like, no one is going to feel safe if they live in a diverse community and their complete police force from the top to the bottom doesn't reflect who they are. the research on diversity in juries, diversity, I mean, all of that is established. I think you're right there, but that is the baseline. That's the baseline. We have to move forward in justice and safety. And no, we're not safe just because we have black police officers.
Let me also say where diversity matters. Who your state attorneys are, who your prosecutors are, who your judges are. It's not just the diversity of the police force. It is the diversity of those who you would want to be holding officers accountable and those decision makers that are over them. That is the diversity not only of race and gender, but of thought, like someone said. Because listen, I have had negative experiences with police officers, just like Philip. And when I'm sitting on the floor of the Florida House of Representatives, I bet I'm one of the few. And that's important that I'm in there, so when this discussion is had, I can at least say, look, this is what's happened to me, and offer that background and that context. That diversity of thought is extremely important when we're in rooms deciding how to deal with this.